Hey, class. This is your first lecture uh, for History 111C since we've gone to all online teaching for the rest of the semester. And today I'd like to talk to you all about stuff from chapters 24 and 25 in your book. These are the chapters that lead up to World War One, and the chapters that deal with the period from the ending of World War One going into the build up to World War Two. Now, one thing I'd just like to say to you that uh, we're in a unique situation right now. Uh, you know, one of the things uh, that is really interesting about the World War One period is that people who lived through that period, uh, many of them understood that a conflict was coming, but they honestly did not realize, how severe the conflict would be. And it's really interesting because that's actually the kind of situation that we're dealing with right now. Um, you know, I had been hearing about coronavirus for a long time, for several months. Uh, it had been, I know I had mentioned it in class. It had been an issue of concern for a while. But I don't think most of us understood just how severe it could be. And to be honest with you, I think that uh, most of us still don't understand how bad the situation can be. Sometimes the world just changes suddenly uh, right in front of you. That's happened to me a couple of times in my lifetime. Uh, I think about 9/11 and how everything suddenly changed. And so, as we're studying history here, I think that this is the time when you can really kind of allow um, what you're studying to help you understand what's going on now. That, in life, uh, just personally and for the world in general, sometimes things can happen very suddenly. Sometimes profound change can just open up and can really turn everything around from what you had been used to seeing. And, that's what we're going through right now. I mean, this is a rather unpleasant situation because, it's an epidemic. There's a lot of sickness, a lot of people getting sick. Unfortunately, thousands of people are dying. Uh, but, that's part of the human condition. I mean, from time to time, these really bad things happen. Well, anyway, that's enough editorializing about what we're going through right now uh, at this time. I want to go back into the past again. Now, chapter 24 and chapter 25. Um, Chapter 24, deals with the world leading up to World War One. The development of what we could call the modern world in the beginning of the 20th century. And we've been talking about this for a while: the Industrial Revolution, how you have mass production, uh, the growth of science. The increasing reliance on science to understand and explain the world, and also something else that's kind of popped back into the picture again, in our own current day, that we see developing at this time at the end of the 19th century and going into the 20th century is the development of nationalism. Now, when we were, at the end of, before we went into spring break, we were talking about um, nationalism, and we were talking about realpolitik, and we were talking about colonialism. Now, the interesting thing about realpolitik and nationalism is that, in that period from the ending of the revolutions of 1848 up until about 1871, there was a major sea change in European history, in Europe, in that you had the unification of Italy, you had the unification of Germany. All of a sudden you had these two major countries coming into existence in Europe. And so you had these two major powers developing new powers, you know, uh, that was suddenly in competition with older powers like Britain and France, Russia. And these countries wanted, to use the German term, they wanted their place in the sun. And of course, realpolitik, uh, this approach to diplomacy, in which war and conflict were kind of seen as simply another way of doing business. This really became the way to approach things at this time. Now, the thing to understand about realpolitik is that realpolitik, was effective. I mean, it allowed these major countries to get what they wanted. It allowed Italy and Germany to get what they wanted, and their success made other people want to have success too. In particular, we see that people in Eastern and Southern Europe, a lot of Slavic people in particular, like if we look at people in the Balkans, the modern day countries of, like the Croatians, the Czechs, or who were also at that time were referred to as Bohemians, Slovaks, Poles, Serbs, Bosnians. These people looked at this nationalism and they felt that, hey, we can achieve something here. And so therefore, what we see is that, older empires like the Austrian Empire and the Ottoman Empire were coming under a lot of pressure. Uh, as nationalism became more popular, the idea of living in a large empire, being led by people who are ethnically different from you, people who did not have your linguistic traditions, people who did not have your cultural traditions, or with whom you did not share religion, possibly. All this became a lot less attractive. Now, and also what we see too is that the principles of realpolitik that allowed for the development of these new nation states, this philosophical approach, this particular governing philosophy, was applied by major countries to their relationships to each other. Now, what this meant is that as we get into the latter part of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, since realpolitik pretty much assumed that you were going to fight, that war was a tool that you could use, there became less and less of a tendency to avoid war. People tended to see war as part of the price of doing business. People tended to see war as something that was inevitable, that you were going to have to do. And really, one of the ways that people tried to deal with war was through the development of alliances. Like for instance, you see, by 1878, you see the development of the Triple Alliance. This is the alliance between Germany and Italy and Austria. You know, this is an attempt by these countries to, have their backs, to have each other's backs if there's a conflict. Similarly, by the early part of the 20th century, we see the development of not a formal alliance, but what's known as the Entente Cordiale and eventually the Triple Entente between the countries of France, Britain, and Russia. And, the development of the Entente in particular is kind of interesting because France and Britain traditionally had been rivals. They didn't have a particularly friendly relationship with each other, even though they were on the same side during the Crimean War. But what happens is that Britain and France almost go to war in 1898 in a place that nowadays is part of the country of South Sudan, a place called Fashoda. This is during the colonial period. The British had managed to occupy Sudan by 1898. They had occupied Egypt earlier, which had controlled Sudan. And so by 1898, the British are able to remove the government of Sudan, which had been ruled by a fellow by the name of Mahdi, who called himself the Mahdi. His name was Muhammad Ahmed. And they had removed him. But at the same time, you had the French coming from the west. The French had occupied a lot of kind of the Central Sahara states of Niger, Mali, and Chad. And they were in Chad, and they were moving eastward. And so the French and the British, came upon each other in the Sudanese town of Fashoda. Now, both armies were there. Now, fortunately, the leaders of both armies had cool enough heads that they decided not to fight each other. And instead, they sent people to telegram back to Europe, to their respective countries, to see what to do. Now, ultimately, the two countries talked, and the French said, well, we will withdraw. Excuse me. This territory is, according to our maps, is territory that the British have a claim to. And so the French withdrew. But then after that, the British and the French, started talking. And by 1904, they had the Entente Cordiale. By 1907, Russia became a member, too. And so you have a situation in which there's increasing tension in Europe. But everybody's picking sides. Three of the major powers are on one side, Britain, France, and Russia. And on the other side, you have Germany, Italy, and Austria. Now, I don't have a map behind me, but, you all look in your books and you will see that from a strategic standpoint, Germany was in a bit of a pickle. The Triple Alliance was in a bit of a pickle because the Triple Alliance was surrounded on both sides. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Don't mean to be yawning on you. By members of the Entente Cordiale. And so that put them at a disadvantage. But we'll get into that later on with the war. But anyway, to get back to the lead up to the war, as you had increasing pushes for countries to get their independence, you saw increasing conflict. For instance, in Europe, you had the various Slavic peoples, fighting against the Austrian Empire. You had people, fighting against the Ottomans. The Ottomans, were rapidly losing territory in Europe, and they were getting pushed out. And so, in the years immediately before World War One, you had a couple of Balkans wars. You had a Balkan War in 19. Oh my goodness! You had a Balkans War in 1911, and you had one in 1913. And the result of these wars was that the Ottomans pretty much got pushed out of Europe, and you had a number of countries that were really unhappy with their borders. And in particular, you had the Serbs who looked at Austria and felt that Austria was, denying them the ability to unify their country. And so you had a lot of very, very unhappy people. Now, the other side of this unhappiness, you know, came at the colonial level. You know, by the time you get to 1900, European countries have occupied pretty much all of the world. I mean, before we had to shut down meeting in classes, uh, you know, um, my grad assistant, Olabada Shadada, he had done a presentation on colonialism. And as you all should remember, all of Africa except for Ethiopia and Liberia have been colonized. Similarly, there have been significant colonization in Asia too. And colonization, was something that happened. All major countries got in the act. The United States got in the act. Now, the United States, of course, for many years was primarily concerned with getting control of territory on the continental United States. But by 1890, the United States had pretty much filled up the territory of the lower 48, and already had control of Alaska. America had bought Alaska in the 1860s from Russia, and by 1886, the United States had gotten control of the island nation of Hawaii. Hawaii had been an independent country, and Americans were able to come in there and establish businesses, and eventually overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy. And we see that America, eventually went to war with Spain and got control of the areas of Puerto Rico. That's how Puerto Rico became part of the United States. America took Puerto Rico in the Spanish-American War. Uh, and also America got control of Guam, got control of the Philippines, and they were able to get control of Cuba. Now, America did not keep Cuba as a colony. Cuba became independent. But although Cuba was an independent country, uh, America, had a huge amount of control on Cuba. So although Cuba was independent, they weren't really independent. They were pretty much, under the thumb of the United States government. And so, you have a bunch of new countries that, were becoming colonial powers. Now, also, the other thing that's interesting, too, is that in Asia, Japan had become a colonial power. And this is interesting because Japan is the one country at this time that was not run by people of European extraction, or white people, for lack of a better term, that became a major colonial power. Uh, Japan had been forced to open up by the United States in the 1850s. The United States sent the Navy under Commodore Perry to Japan, and it forced the Japanese to open up. But the Japanese soon realized that they were at a major disadvantage dealing with the Western powers. And so what we see is they have, the old shogun system gets removed. They have a new emperor. And it's what's known as the Meiji, revolution, or the Meiji movement. in which the Japanese begin to send their people to Europe, and particularly send a lot of people to Germany. And they get Western education, they learn how the Western political system works. And they also begin to industrialize. And so what we see is that between 1860 and 1895, the Japanese modernize their economy, they modernize their political system, and they also industrialize. And so what this meant is that the Japanese, since they're emulating the European powers, they realize that if they want to have independence, they need to, instead of being colonized, they need to colonize territory themselves. So what the Japanese do, they imitate the European powers, and they start getting active in China, because at this time, remember going back to the Opium War, when Britain defeated China in the Opium War and Britain took Hong Kong. From that point forward, Western powers had been in China, and although China never formally became a colony, increasingly Western powers had control of various parts of China. And so the Japanese got in on the act. The Japanese had come in, that took control of Korea in around 1890. Now, at this time, initially, the Western powers forced Japan to give a lot of this back, but the Japanese come back again. By 1895, they have control of Korea. The Japanese also come into conflict with Russia, because, Russia had been moving into territory that had traditionally been held by the Chinese, for a few hundred years. I mean, really going back to the 17th century. The Russians have been pushing into northeastern Asia, and have been occupying territories that traditionally the Chinese government had controlled. And so eventually by 1905, you have a major war between Russia and Japan, the Russo-Japanese War. And the Japanese win. And this is a shocking thing to the West, because really, due to the massive colonial success of Western countries, they had come to see themselves as just inherently superior to anybody who was not of European extraction. And so when the Japanese defeated the Russians, this shocked the Western world. And it really had a devastating impact on Russia, because the Russians, became Europeans who could not defeat non-European people. Now, this happened at a lesser level in other places. I mean, for instance, 9 years earlier in Ethiopia, the Italians had tried to expand into Ethiopia, and they were defeated by the Ethiopian army and pushed out of Ethiopia at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Now, in this case, the Ethiopian king, a fellow by the name of Menelik II, simply had been a very, very good diplomat. And he took advantage of colonial rivalries. And he had been able to secure enough modern weapons that when the Italians came in, the Ethiopians simply had more machine guns than they did. And they were able to defeat the Italian army. And so what we see in at the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, is that Europeans had controlled most of the world, but they were starting to reach their limits. Now, as I said before, you had this rivalry between the European countries. But to put things in perspective, Europe had not had a major war between European powers really since, now my hands are washed, so I'm not giving myself coronavirus, by touching my face. I know that's something that you're not supposed to do, but I've been washing my hands pretty good. I haven't been outside the house, so I don't think I'm going to kill myself because I rubbed my eyes just now. At least let's cross my fingers and hope that's the case. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that, because that is the 800-pound gorilla in the room right now. But anyway, as I was saying before, um, you know, there were, the European countries were kind of reaching the limits of their technology at this time. They controlled a lot of the world, but they were starting to bump into each other. They were starting to meet resistance from colonial people. Your book mentions, for instance, Indians, pushing back, people in India pushing back against the British. And so, there was a lot of pushback. People in the Middle East, in particular Arabic speakers, wanted independence from the Turks. The Turks themselves wanted to modernize Turkey. And so this nationalism, colonialism, they were all starting to push against each other. And as I said before, there had not been a major war in Europe for about 100 years. Remember, when we started the semester, we talked about the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. And, Napoleon had been defeated in 1814. He came back in 1815. He got beat again. And so by the time we get to World War One starts in 1914. So by the time we get to World War One, it's been 100 years since there's been a major war. Nobody remembers it. Wars have been short during the period of realpolitik. You look at the Franco-Prussian War. The actual shooting war was only a few weeks. It lasted about a year simply because the French government collapsed. The Franco-Prussian War was a short war. All these wars have been short. And this is significant. All these short wars made people less fearful of war. This is a period of time in which war tended to be fought with very, very little collateral damage. In other words, there was very, very little damage to civilians. Only young men died. And so because of that, people in charge had a lot less fear of war than they might have in other circumstances. And this may, and as I said, because the philosophy of realpolitik pretty much assumed that war was going to happen, you end up in an environment where people are more and more inclined to push towards war. Now, the other thing that's really significant is that a military technology had really changed, during the, ending of the 19th century going into the 20th century. You have the development of machine guns, like the Maxim gun, the Gatling gun. These are big, heavy guns that have to be mounted, but, still they're machine guns. You have the development of poison gas. By the early part of the 20th century, the airplane has been invented. Automobiles and trucks become common. To get a good idea of what World War One is like, for those of you all who have cable, rent 1917. That was a recent movie. Very, very good reviews. And, it gives you a pretty good idea of what World War One's like. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself right now, but that's just something, and that's not something, or it's not required for class, but for the period we're talking about right now, if since you're at home, if you can afford it, check out 1917. I think it's an interesting movie. But as I said before, Europe kind of loses inhibition towards war. And so in the period, heading up to 1914, like I said, you had the Balkans Wars, and then also you had a young emperor in Germany, William II. And, William II was a very brash fellow. And because he was so brash, you end up with having, two major crises under him. With France, one in 1904 and one in 1907. In both cases, revolving around, Africa, Morocco. In 1904, the emperor actually goes to Morocco, even though this is an area that the French control. And, he basically talks about, supporting independence, something that is very threatening to the French. You almost have war. but they managed to back out. The second time, in 1907, he is very provocative, and he ends up being able to get some territorial adjustments, and that, down in Central Africa. But the danger about this is that William II, because he is so brash, he doesn't allow his diplomats to do any talking. He kind of just does it himself. And, if the leader does it himself, you don't really have a way to back out of it. You don't have what's known as plausible deniability. And so the point to be made is that on all sides in Europe at this time, people find themselves getting in more and more tense situations. The book mentions, like, for instance, the British in South Africa, the South African War, that used to be referred to as the Boer War, where Britain became very, very unpopular for its brutal treatment of the Afrikaners, or they were known as Boers back then. They spoke Afrikaans, which is a version of Dutch, and the Dutch word for farmer is Boer, so that's how they got that name. But in defeating them, the British were very brutal towards them, and this hurt the British image in Europe. And so, going into 1914, everybody knew there was going to be a war. It was just a matter of when. And because of the realpolitik attitude, nobody was really trying to avoid war. And so eventually, when the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria is assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, nobody's surprised. Everybody just says, all right, let's go to war. Austria makes demands on Serbia they can't meet. Austria declares war on Serbia. Germany follows suit. Now, Italy, interestingly enough, flips sides and goes on the other side. But the Ottoman Empire comes in on the side of the Germans and the Austrians. British and the French, declare war. Russia declares war too. And so all of a sudden you get to World War One. And World War One was a major wake-up call for Europeans because, as I said before, Europeans had all this modern technology. And with few exceptions, for instance, like the Russians, they got hammered, good by the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. But with these few exceptions, Europeans had never been exposed to the kind of weapons that they used on people in the developing world. And so, once this war starts, they get hammered. And it's really interesting because, like, for instance, the Germans, they had a military leader, a German general by the name of von Schlieffen. And because Germany was, since they faced France on the west and Russia on the east, the whole idea of the Schlieffen plan was to quickly attack France. And so they could then go back and, shut down Russia. And so, this is what they implemented. And so, therefore, what we see is that, the Germans quickly go through Belgium, which was a violation of international law because Belgium was a neutral party. The Germans go through Belgium. They're quite brutal. They occupy French territory. But what happens is that very quickly, the different sides establish trenches, and they soon realize that, their traditional methods of fighting, of getting the infantry together and, charging at the other side simply would not work, with this new technology. Since you have machine guns, and, especially if you put it in a good high position, if you try to charge a machine gun nest, these guys just simply wail on charging soldiers. And so what we see in World War One is that within, a few months, you already have over 1 million people dead. And so therefore, for most of World War One, it's a war of stalemate. You have the Germans in one trench, you have the French and the British in another trench. On the Eastern Front, you have Russia. Now, Russia, interesting enough, collapses during World War One, and eventually, you have the Bolshevik Revolution, and Russia transforms into the Soviet Union. But like I said, that's a little bit of ahead of the story here. But basically, most of World War II is a very slow and nasty conflict. People going from one trench to another. Thousands of people dying just to move a few yards. And so, basically, you have soldiers spending 4 years in muddy trenches and open fields, dealing with rats and dead bodies. A very, very miserable way to live. And this has a huge effect on a young generation of Europeans, having fought through World War One, or as the British refer to it as the Great War. Now, America, however, stays out of the war a very long time. Eventually, the American president, Woodrow Wilson, gets the United States involved in the war around July of 1917. And this makes a huge difference because the Americans, it's, for lack of a better analogy, it's kind of like a football game, and you have two teams that are very evenly matched. But one team has a deeper bench. And the Americans were the deeper bench. They came in and they were able to push. And this allowed the side of the Triple Entente to eventually win. Now, World War One was a very, very nasty war, very, very brutal war. And so because of this, once it was over, people decide that they don't want to, they really want to try to avoid fighting again. Now, Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States at this time, he's an interesting fellow. He's the only history professor, PhD in history to have become president. Very, very smart man. Had a lot of ideals. Unfortunately, he was also a very racist man. That's not a word I use lightly. But he was very much a product of the American South. He grew, he was born before slavery was illegal. He grew up in a slave environment. And his attitudes towards people who were not Western people, was very much kind of an imperial assumption of superiority. And, like, for instance, I'm assuming you all have probably seen that movie, The Peacemakers, that I assigned you by now. And, his attitude was largely why, people from the colonial world were very unhappy with the results that came after World War II. After World War One. But the bottom line is that, World War One is fought. And World War One really undermines the European sense of self. European people don't see themselves as quite the same anymore. That confidence, that deep feeling of superiority that they had before the war went away. And there's a lot of insecurity. And so, not surprisingly, this sets the stage for disruptive people to come into power. And eventually, you end up with another major conflict, World War II. And I'm going to talk about that in another lecture that I'm going to record later on today, too. Now, just for a little bit of housekeeping, our next major assignment for a grade in this class is going to be reading the book Under a Cruel Star. Now, I'm going to give you guys instructions on how I want you to go about reading the book. But it's really important to understand that the material that we're reading in chapters 24, 25, 26, 27, that material is going to help put the book Under a Cruel Star within a better perspective, so you all can get more out of it. Well, anyway, that's it for now. I'm gonna record another lecture later on today, and I'm gonna post this one up right now. I'll post the other one later on too. So, and hopefully these lectures will give you guys some guidance on what to get out of readings. Anyway, that's it for now. Stay safe. Wash your hands. Avoid. Maintain your social distance. Don't go out a whole lot. Please don't be showing up at your friends' houses and socialize and that kind of thing. You really want to minimize your contact with other people. Because this virus is not a joke. You've heard a lot of people talk about it. It doesn't really do that much damage to young people. That's very misleading. A lot of young people are dead already. And so please be safe. You'll see another lecture pretty soon. Take care.